Private Wax is a funny little codger with a smile. A funny smile. 5 feet none, he's an artful little dodger with a smile. A funny smile. Flush or broke, he'll have his little joke. He can't be suppressed. All the other fellows have to grin when he gets to this off his chest. Hurry! Break up your troubles in your own kit bag and smile, smile, smile. While you balloon it or you like your bag, smile, boys, that's the style. What's the use of worrying? It never was worthwhile. So back up your troubles in your own kit bag and smile, smile, smile. Private Wax went marching into battle with a smile. His funny smile. He was loved by the privates and commanders for his smile. His funny smile. When a bunch of soldiers came along with a mighty swing, Wax yelled out, this little bunch is mine. Keep your head down, boys, and sing. Hurry, hurry! Up in your own kit bag and smile, smile, smile. While you were wild, but good night, goodbye, 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 goodbye. What fear of the world is never It's time and
Thank you. Thank you, and welcome to the East River Reading Room into Women Tell by the Decades, the 1920s. My name is Denise Keys Page, and I'd like to welcome all of you to this afternoon of story. And I'd like to thank you for your support and contribution to this, our first endeavor. I'd like to take just a moment to tell you a little bit about how this came to pass. During the era of COVID, I was attending a workshop via Zoom. And in one of the breakout rooms, I was with another storyteller. And this isn't the par for either of us, but somehow we had not done our homework. So we weren't talking about what we were supposed to talk about in the breakout room. As a facilitator, that was really difficult for me. But we continued to have a lovely conversation anyway. And then we went back to the big room, and then back to the breakout room. And when we came back, my partner in the breakout room said to me, you know, something you said triggered a memory for me about my mother. And I'm going to spend some time with it because I think it's something that I really need to excavate and work into a story. And I said, well, do you want to share what you're thinking about so far? And she said, well, I don't have it together yet, but my mother in 1927, and I got chills, because the night before I had told to a friend a story I was working on about my mother in 1927. And in that moment, that voice said, there is a need for women's stories to be laid side by side. And in that moment, I made a commitment to put together something where we'd have that opportunity. And then I called a friend, Jen Monroe, and I told her what I was thinking. And Jen, God bless her, she didn't hesitate. She said, that's a lovely idea. Yes. Neither one of us thought there might be a cost attached to that. So that's a great idea. Let's go for it. And so we went for it. And that's what brought us here today and brought you here with us. So with no further ado, I'd like to present to you that magnificent woman whose word is yes, whose stories are golden, who brings a wealth of experience in storytelling in the story world. She's highly regarded in the story world. But as her friend, I can tell you she's equally as regarded as a friend. So with no further ado, I have the pleasure of presenting to you Miss Jen Monroe, Circle of Excellence winner. Jen.
Thank you, Denise. I am your illustrious MC for this afternoon, so it is my great pleasure to introduce our first storyteller, Connie Rockman, the woman who started it all. You have no idea how much work you created for me. Sidney Sheldon says that libraries store the energy that fuels the imagination. Our first storyteller, Connie Rockman, has not only been releasing that energy as a gifted children's librarian for 50 years, yes, but has also used her considerable storytelling skills to spark the imaginations of adults and children alike. She has also created many of the reading guides which appear in the backs of scholastic books for young adult novels. And today, she brings us a poignant and aptly named story called Lillian's Library. Connie Rockman.
Thank you, Jen, for that gracious introduction. I grew up in Philadelphia, and those of you who don't know Philadelphia might not realize that that city is a collection of small towns. One of them is called Tacony. This is a history of Tacony, and that's where my mother grew up. It was in the fall of 1968 that I had one of those moments of epiphany when I suddenly realized what I was going to do with the rest of my life. I was going to become a children's librarian. I had 2 toddlers, I had a husband, I had a house in the suburbs, but I made a decision that I had to go to library school, get that degree, and become a librarian. There was a special bonus from me making that choice. It triggered a memory in my mother. My mother, who was never very forthcoming about her own childhood and had never shared many stories about her growing up in Philadelphia. But this particular memory was vivid. My mother, Lillian, was born in 1911, February 1st, 1911. Her childhood years were war years and pandemic years. But her family lived through the flu epidemic of 1918 and 1920. And in the fall of 1921, when Lillian was 10 years old, she was at that perfect age where you're balanced between childhood and the growing up years. And she was on her way to the best place in her life, skipping down Torresdale Avenue in the Tacony section of Philadelphia. She was on her way to the neoclassical brick and granite solid building that was the Tacony branch of the Free Library of Philadelphia. Every Saturday morning, the children's librarian told stories, and it was Lillian's favorite hour of the week. Her nagging older sister stayed away. Her pesky younger brothers were too young to go. It was her hour. to listen to the most wonderful tales of adventure and beauty and excitement, and she couldn't wait for Saturday morning to come every week. The librarian, she told me, Miss Backrack, was a rather severe woman. She described her as just the way you picture those stereotypical 1920s librarians with their hair pulled straight back in a very tight bun, looking rather stern. But she said to me, when Miss Backrack started to tell a story, she became beautiful. Her eyes would sparkle. Her face would take on different expressions, and her voice would share the awe or the excitement or the terror of what was happening in the story. And part of that memory that Lillian shared with me was that she would look up above Miss Backrack's head at the tall arched windows where the sun would stream down into the children's room. And she would imagine she was watching scenes from those stories being acted out in the sunbeams coming through the windows. Oh, yes, that story time was her favorite time of the week. And the years went on. In 1926, the Tacony Library was going to have a facelift for its 20th anniversary. This building had been built in 1906. It was one of the buildings that were funded by Andrew Carnegie in the city of Philadelphia. And for its 20th anniversary, they were going to transform a lecture room at the back of the library into a brand new children's room. Now, the librarian who had watched Lillian grow up through the years had seen her age out of story time, but still come into the library several times a week to work on her homework. She was an avid student. And the librarian approached her and asked her how old she was. Well, it turned out that just after this renovation was happening, Lillian was turning 16 at the beginning of 1927. And the librarian said, you know, when you're 16, you could get an after-school job at the library. She could make money in the place that she loved so much. What could be better? Encouraged by her teachers and her librarian, Lillian planned to get an after-school job and maybe even start saving money to go to college. Wouldn't that be amazing? Well, she didn't share this dream with her family. She could only imagine them saying, now, what on earth would a girl in this family want to go to college for? So she kept that to herself. And finally, the morning of her 16th birthday arrived, and she came bounding downstairs, ready to go to school, only to be stopped by the stern countenance of her father at the bottom of the stairs. You're not going to school today, he said. Your sister has set up an interview for you at the Sears Roebuck offices where she works. Now that you're 16, you're going to have to go to work and start contributing something to this family if we're all going to have enough to eat. Now, Henry Storm was a stern, autocratic German father. There was no arguing with him. There was no possibility that she could change his mind. And that very day, Lillian was hired to work at the headquarters of Sears Roebuck. She never went back to finish her last year and a half of high school. Now, I always knew that my mother resented not going to college. Oh, she went on to have a fine career. She started out in the secretarial pool at Sears, but soon she graduated out of the typing pool and became a private secretary to one of the department heads. a kindly man who offered her advice about things she could read and ways she could improve herself. Now, I knew she always resented not having to go to college. But I didn't know until she was 90 years old that she didn't have a high school degree. We were discussing family history sometime around her 90th birthday. And somehow in the course of what we were talking about, she shared that little story with me about her father and her 16th birthday. It was a story she had kept hidden from all of us all those years. But at 90, you're losing some of your filters and you might as well share these things. My mother, Lillian, lived to be 102. Her last year and a half were spent in what we now euphemistically call a memory care facility. So when I would go to visit her, she wasn't always sure who I was. Sometimes I was a friend coming from New York, or sometimes I was a cousin she hung out with when she was a girl. I went along with whatever persona she wanted to give me. But on the occasion of her 102nd birthday, 86 years after her 16th birthday, we were visiting and talking, and as she often did in those days, she was living in the past. And she mentioned her father. And then all of a sudden, in a rare moment of lucidity, she looked at me very sharply and she said, "He's not around anymore, is he?" "No," I said. He actually died in 1953. That's quite some time ago. "Well," said Lillian, without missing a beat, "good riddance."
Masks and glasses just don't work well together, do they? Before I lower the screen and before I pray to the gods of technology to make this work, I really want to thank our following sponsors for their generosity, for going a little bit above and beyond and donating to this what we hope will be a series of 6 shows. Our second show will be June the 5th, and if we have your email address, then we'll be able to give you more information. If not, you can sign up down here. But our sponsors, the Sherwood Financial Group, Jessica Robinson of the storytelling series Better Said Than Done, the real estate agent Todd Gould. We are extremely grateful for their financial support. Hopefully our next storyteller, Vicky Judith, is coming to us live from Los Angeles. She is an actress, comedian, writer, and spoken word artist who takes moments from her life and spins them into stories that shed light on universal truths. She's also light on her feet and loves to dance to swing and rockabilly music. I have no idea what rockabilly music is, but I'm sure it's great to dance to. As I hope you will hear, that love of rhythm spills into her storytelling and is much in evidence in her story, Little Army of Women. Vicky Judith.
waiting to see the picture. Can you see me? No.
Here we go. It's coming now.
Okay. Ah, okay. All right. On the wall of my dining room, there's an oil painting. I'll show it to you. It's of a white farmhouse. There's a tall pine tree sheltering the house. There's a little crescent-shaped porch with white pillars in the front. My mother, Lillian, grew up in this farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania with her mother, Ruth, Ruth's sister, Eva, and Ruth and Eva's mother, Maisie, my mother's grandmother. I owned this farmhouse for half a dozen years after my mother died. And I felt guilty that I wasn't my great-great-grand farm in the family. During the pandemic, inside, I all my meals in the dining room, breakfast, lunch, dinner, farmhouse, I feel guilty, I cried. So on this one particular day, I'm not crying, I'm just I dust the painting, I dust the photos in the room, I vacuum. I go to put the vacuum cleaner away in the closet, and I see a box. Now, before I sold the farmhouse, I had some things sent here to my house in California, some furniture, and the box. Now, the buyer outside, I'm not going to at that time. I open the box. Oh, yes. Gettysburg Hall Yearbook. The first two are from the 1920s. 1922, that would be my great Aunt Eva, and then 1928 would be my grandmother, the younger sister. And I marvel that my great grandmother Maisie, running that farm, sent her girls to college in rural Pennsylvania in the 1920s, right? That was unheard of. And I know Maisie wasn't her husband Henry, because he was never around. He died in the bed of the local Madison with brothel. So I pull this box out of the dining room, out of the closet, sit down in the dining room, and I pick up that first yearbook, 1922. Now my great Aunt Elva, she doesn't have a solo picture, but she's in a group photo. I picked her out right away, striking. And the caption to this photo says, "This little army of who have matched their brains and men's intellect against great odds and numbers, against traditional prejudice. The college has offered them war rooms, any privilege beyond that of basement, and dedicated back to 65 girls, and they aspire to be teachers, journalists, doctors, chemists, and not only charming housewives." Okay. So really, what they're saying is that women were not welcome at the college, and really,
So apologies for technical issues.
Was to make a woman a more useful wife.
It behoves me.
Well, my
to
great
step
Aunt
into the-
Eva,
She's still talking. She
married,
doesn't have her speaker
she
on.
went on to Johns Hopkins,
So she can't
got
hear
her
us?
doctorate in literature, and she became Dr.
well,
Eva
I think we just carry
and she
on
was head of
without
the English
her. You
department
couldn't
at a very
understand.
respected
Yeah.
public high
So-
school, William.
And Jen, if I could just say, on the video that you'll get, we can tag her story on it, so you won't miss her story.
Oh. All right, I feel much better now. So
what she just said is more work for me.
what I loved about Connie's story was the expectation of going to college. I grew up in a low working class family. My mother left school when she was 14, so did my father, so did my relatives. In fact, I was the first person to actually attend college in my family, and that I did after I left school at 16. and I was working for the government. And someone said, "How old are you, Jen?" And I said, "I'm 17. And so he said, "You can go to college 1 day a week, the local community college." I said, "I'm out of here." And 1 day a week, I studied for examinations, and I managed to earn my way into the University College of North Wales. So there was never any expectation in my family for anyone to go to college. And my Auntie Lily was no exception. And she was a woman of the 20s, but in the 50s when this story occurs. And my Auntie Lily's character was formed by the 20s, was formed by going through the Second World War. She was a feisty woman, and she took no prisoners. And she was a beautiful woman. She was tall and she was elegant. She had long auburn hair that she piled high on the top of her head in a bun. She wore long golden earrings that reached all the way down to her shoulders, and she always wore designer clothes. But the thing that there were 4 kids in my family, apart from me, 3 plus me, but the thing that we loved best about my Auntie Lily was the fact that she swore. She swore like a troop. Even swore when she came over for tea on Sundays. And my mother, who could not abide bad language of any kind, never said a word. But there was an air of mystery surrounding Auntie Lily that I found compelling, if a little dangerous. And my mother managed to persuade her to take me into town for a much-needed pair of school shoes. So early one Saturday morning we set off. I was feeling a little dowdy in my homemade cotton dress, but Auntie Lily looked frightening in her black designer suit with the nipped-in waist, black silk stockings with seams as straight as 2 ruled lines, long golden gypsy earrings. They bounced on her shoulders when we walked. We went all the way down to the bus stop. We didn't have long to wait. The Midland Red bus came roaring down the street. It took one look at Auntie Lily and screeched to a halt. The driver stared, the passengers gaped, and the young bus conductor tiptoed back from the doorway as if Aphrodite in all her naked glory was standing at his bus stop. My Auntie Lily noticed none of this. With an air of unconscious superiority, she began to board the bus. She was just about to pull herself up when all of a sudden, the elastic in her 100% French Parisian silk camisole knickers broke. Her underwear fluttered around her legs like a flag in the breeze, falling in a silken sigh around her ankles. Everybody froze. There was no movement except for the violent blush in the lard pale face of the young bus conductor. "Oh, you bugger," Auntie Lily swore. The bloody elastics broke, and without missing a beat, she stepped out of the offending underwear, picked them up, shook them, folded them, and popped them into her purse. A gasp of unabashed admiration rippled among the passengers as we took our seats. And when we got into town, we were allowed to get off the bus first. Without even a backward glance, we sailed into town. We went all the way through the marketplace, all the way to a tiny, exclusive shoe store where my mother only ever dared window shop, but of course we marched right in. Auntie Lily bought for me a pair of black pattern, silver buckled, totally unsuitable. I'll never be allowed in town with Auntie Lily again. School shoes. When we came out, I clutched those shoes to my chest, fearful that someone would snatch them from me. We were walking back down the street, down to the bus station, when it began to pour. It came down in buckets. Sod it, Auntie Lily swore, forgotten me bloody umbrella. Come on, Jen. She grabbed hold of my hand. We ran down the street. When we got to the bus station, we dived into the ladies' lavatory. I'm bloody well wet through, she said. And then I watched while she repaired the damage. She took out a little lace handkerchief from her pocket and spread it on the shelf. And then she unpinned the bun from the top of her head. She took it off. She dried it, put it on the shelf. Next, she took out her teeth. She washed them off, dried them, put them on the shelf. And then, for her pièce de résistance, she took out her right eye. She washed it off, dried it, and put it on the shelf. In 3 swift strokes, my Auntie Lily had gone from a tall, elegant woman into a straggle-haired, sunken-faced, one-eyed old hag. I stared at her in open-mouthed admiration. She looked at me with her one good eye. You must always remember this, Jen. I think I will, Auntie. No, she said, indicating the various parts of herself on the shelf. What I'm about to tell you. Things are never ever what they seem. Beauty, it's not even skin deep. And always take good care of your teeth. I will, Auntie. And then I watched while she put herself back together. She took the bun and pinned it in place on the top of her head. She took the teeth, popped them back into her mouth, and then she inserted the glass eye into the empty eye socket. A little lipstick, a little eyeshadow, completed the reformation. She stood back from the mirror. How do I look, Jen? Well, I have to tell you, I looked at my Auntie Lily, and I could see that the red of her hair didn't quite match the red of her bun. I could see the rigid perfection of the false teeth and the frozen, unseeing stare of the glass eye. And in that moment, I suddenly realized that I was actually seeing my Auntie Lily for the very first time. And it was in that moment that I understood exactly what she had been trying to tell me. And without any further hesitation, I looked at my Auntie Lily and I said, "You are beautiful." And of course, she was. When I first started creating stories about my family, I honestly thought that I had no interesting characters about whom to create stories. So it should come as no surprise to you to learn that my Auntie Lily was married to my Uncle Harry, who was the ugliest man in the world, who had a pet monkey. But when you're a little girl growing up, you think everybody has an uncle who's got a pet monkey. and everybody's aunt can take herself apart. She had no reason to take out those teeth. And she told my mother later, she said, "Barbara, what I wouldn't have given for a bloody false leg at that time." Well, our next storyteller is number 3. There she is. Denise Keys Page, our illustrious, or my illustrious co-producer, who suggested this might be a very good idea. And I believe it is. I think it so much interest in hearing stories about women, ordinary women, like my Auntie Lily, like Carol's mother, Connie's mother, and Nana Morley, extraordinary women. Denise Keys Page is relatively new to the storytelling world, but she's certainly making her mark. I have a suspicion that Denise makes her mark wherever she goes. Her stories, at once personal and universal, deal with friendship, loss, and identity, told from the perspective of a middle-class New Englander of African American heritage. She's also the producer of another storytelling series, Ubuntu, which focuses on stories of inclusion, diversity, and equity. And she has more information about Ubuntu, and you can see her.
Pizzas are in the back.
Okay, great. Okay, so it's all in the back, all taken care of. So please welcome Denise Keys Page.
Usually this happens when I'm on video like that. Just hang it to the microphone. Since it's video. The story I'm going to share with you today is a story that I heard many, many times when I was growing up. The second part of the story that I'll share with you this afternoon, I heard fewer times. And lately, this story has been screaming to be told in its entirety. You see, I have very few stories of my mother's childhood. Not many told by her, and not many told of her. And I think when I share this story with you today, you'll understand why that is. The story that I'm going to share, the first part, is the story I requested most often from my mother. And I'm going to share it with you in her voice, in my mother's voice, and the way I loved to hear it, with the words that she used. Her story, Mariah. Nisi, she called me Nisi more often than Denise. Nisi, when I was a very little girl, 7 years of age actually, I know because it was only months after my dad had died of tuberculosis. And on weekends, I would be lying in a barren room, tucked tightly in a cot. And the only light was the flickering light from the gas street lamps below. Across from me, also in a cot, about 3 feet away, lay my recently widowed mother. And I lie there so still waiting to hear a whimper from her, but none was forthcoming. I cried to myself, Mother, Mommy, but I never said anything aloud because I was afraid of no response. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you can speak closer to the mic, please. Thank you.
Better? Whoa. I got to back up. You're good? Okay. So, I never whispered her name aloud because I was afraid of no response. So instead, I lie there with my heart thumping wildly, waiting instead for Midnight Mariah. Now, Midnight Mariah was the train that came through town every Saturday night about midnight, and it would blow its big old horn when it exited. Midnight Mariah wasn't really the name of that train. It's what I called her. And that train coming at midnight on Saturday evenings was one of the few remaining constants in my young life. And so I know that it was only fear and daughterly love that kept me awake until midnight. And then I would hear her. Midnight Mariah would come rumbling by, and I'd feel the tremble in my cot, so close were we to the tracks. I'd feel myself rolling gently from side to side in my cot. Her great big one eye illuminated the room for a brief second, and in that second I stole a glance at my mother. When Mariah blew her horn and exited, leaving us again in the darkness and the silence, now, I say to my mother, now that I have something to ask her other than, are you still alive? Mother? Mommy, did you hear her? Did you hear old Mariah blow her horn? And with an interminable silence, I waited. Yes, Dorothy, I heard her. Now please, get some sleep. You need your rest for Sunday school tomorrow. And with that assurance that at least for one more day, God had spared my mother and kept me and my little sister Edwina from being orphans, with that assurance, I went to sleep. And as I slept, I dreamt of a place where we used to go in the summers when my mother and dad were both healthy and my two older sisters were just young teenagers not yet married. And while I was dreaming, it really felt more like remembering. Vividly, longingly, I longed to be at the place where the sloping hills swelled with the Queen Anne's lace and the blueberry bushes met the waters of the Connecticut River. This was my Uncle John and Aunt Josephine's place in Deep River, Connecticut. It was the place that we, the Mannings, spent all our summers with our cousins. As I lay in bed in that barren room, I thought of my aunt and uncle's house, and not our home, the Manning home in New Haven, where I lay with my mother. Because the home in Deep River still was as I remembered it. That home was filled with abundance. Abundant art, abundant life, abundant food, abundant health, and laughter that went on for days and days and days. It was just like the Manning home had been until the sicknesses came. And so it was that in this dream, I would remember my Aunt Josephine and my mom getting the place ready for our summer visits. They would fill those porcelain ceramic basins with water and put one in every room. They took the matelassé comforters out of winter storage and put them on the feather beds, promising the comfort that those swirls of white promised us. I remember those summers as every morning, it seems, I would wake to the clattering of my aunt and mom getting the good silverware on the table. I would wake to the warmth of the sun tantalizing my eyelids. And I could smell, even in my dreams, I could smell the blueberries, which had been lovingly baked into finely rolled crusts of blueberry pie, or simmering on the back of the stove in blueberry slump. Out in the distance, I could hear distantly but distinctly the snap, flap, snap, snap, flap of the laundry hanging on the line. And that sound would penetrate the crispness of the morning air. The air that even in July, one needed a sweater in the early mornings and early evenings. My dad would come into my room, handsome in his tennis whites, though still smelling quite a bit like the oils from the painting he had been doing in the carriage house since the morning light. Dorothy, he would coax me. A new day has dawned and we must get everything out of it. We must make the most of this day that God has given us. Yes, it was of the home in Deep River that I dreamt as I lay in the room with my mother. It was the place where life was good, living was good. In the afternoon, the ladies gathered on the wraparound porch, my mom demure in her native and African beauty, reading, her great passion. My sister Mabel, a teenager then, she would be making Christmas gifts from the bounty that the river and the forest had yielded. And Edna, the fairy princess beauty of the family, and the eldest, she would be writing secret love letters that she never sent to a secret love she never named. Edwina and I, your Aunt Edwina, my baby sister, 3 years younger to the day, she and I would frolic on those sloping hills, roll down the hills, take mystery walks in the woods. We laughed and hooped and hollered and played, and no one ever said, "Shh, your father's sleeping. Shh, your mother's not feeling well from the medication." No one ever said, "Stop teasing Edwina, she's not strong like you." In my dreams, I was still a 7-year-old child with access to childhoodness. It was the last glimmering remnants of life before the illness. Well, on some nights, Nisi, some nights I had a different dream. I dream of the Saturdays that my dad would take me to his art studio with him. He would let me help him paint. And then she would turn to me as if I forget and say, "You know, your grandfather, my dad, he went to Yale Art School from 1913 to 1915. And though he may have been a fine arts graduate, in his studio he would say to me, 'You know, Dorothy, everybody has a need for a good old hand-painted sign.' Like most fine arts graduates, he did the practical to put food on the table for his family. And another thing he said to me in those days, 'You know, Dorothy, not everybody can go to college, but it's a darn fool who doesn't get all the free education that's available to them.'" I hear those words still. And you know those dreams of our summers in Deep River and the Saturdays of my dad in his art studio, those dreams, those memories were so important to me because they gave me hope and peace. And I needed that hope and peace. because eventually, of course, the weekend visits stopped. My mother, not many months after the loss of my dad, succumbed to the breast cancer. Now, your Auntie Dwin and I, we were lucky. We went to one foster family and we were fine. We were safe in every way. And we had enough of everything. But at least one thing had changed. We had gone from the panache of being Ed Manning's daughters, Yaley, to the stigma of being a ward of the state. And believe me, Nisi, in 1927, that was a stigma. But I had the teachings and the examples of my parents. And I had those words rumbling in my brain from my dad. You know, Dorothy, it's a darn fool who doesn't get all the free education that's available to him. Remembering that not only gave me hope, but it gave me a desire to fulfill the legacy. And so I held on to those words. And those words live with me still. I'm grateful for those things that they gave me. Even in the loss of them, they nurtured me. Well, I sat rapt, as I always was, as my mother told this story. A sad story, but one of the few of her childhood she ever shared with me. But on this day, she had more to say. Normally, her story stopped at 1927 when both of her parents died. And they picked up again in 1939 when she met my dad. But in between had been a great wasteland, which I never heard much about. But at the time I was about 16, she shared this with me. In 1936, I was 16, and I had just started New Haven Teachers College. And I did that with a little bit of that money that my dad had squirreled away that the state wasn't supposed to have access to. Well, I supplemented my income by working as a weekend domestic and seamstress for a family on East Rock Road in New Haven. And I liked the work enough. But what I didn't enjoy was the way they always seemed to air their dirty laundry in front of me. Well, actually, it was more like to me. And the missus, when she was tipsy, which was often, she would share the most intimate details, even about her husband. And the mister, when he was in his cups, which was most nights after work, he would leer at me in a way that made me feel unsafe. So I thought it time to find another job, a job that would accommodate my college schedule without sacrificing my safety and virtue. And so it was, and one day I was on Ashland Street. I hadn't been on that side of the town in, well, I don't know when. And as I'm walking along, I see in a dry cleaner's window an advertisement for a presser. Well, that's something I know I can do. So I walk into the dry cleaners and I ask for an application. And the kindly-eyed, whiskered white man on the other side of the counter, his hesitation was barely perceptible, but he handed me one. I filled it out and I handed it back to him. He murmured something, never looking at it. I mumbled something back and turned to walk out, already feeling defeated. But as I was approaching the door, I heard this low rumble, and I felt this slight tremble. And I heard in the distance the roar of an approaching train, and I don't know what came over me, but I stopped. Something stirred in me, and I turned around and talking to the back of that man who was walking to the back of the shop, I said to him, Excuse me, when might I expect to hear something, one way or the other? He turned to face me, The application I was glad to see still in his hand, not yet in the trash. And he's looking at me with a look I can't quite name. But it's not frightening. He looks down at the application. Dorothy Manning. Yes. Well, I knew a fine colored fella by the name of Edwin Manning. Any kin of yours? My dad. My dad. Oh, he was a fine colored gentleman. Folks say he was a Yalie. You know, you remind me of someone with your speech. That's why I stopped when you spoke again. Something about your tone and your well-modulated words. Yes, people do say I sound like my dad. Well, you know, I bought this house from old Mr. Manning. I heard it in slow motion. I bought this house from Mr. Manning. I looked up at the industrial ceiling fan, which of course had not been there when it was our home. And of course the storefront had not been a storefront, it had been a proper parlor when it had been the Manning home. I was standing in my childhood home, where 2 floors above I had lain while waiting for my mother to die in a barren room with only the comfort constant of Midnight Mariah coming by to offer me stability. The gentleman looked at me. When can you start? He asked. And so for the next 2 years, I was the presser in the dry cleaners. I hid in the back room, the room that had been our kitchen. I hid there because you shouldn't come out and do front counter work, you know, because people might not understand. You understand. And of course I understood. So I stayed in the kitchen in the sweltering heat, the room where we had once had abundant food and abundant music and abundant love and abundant health, the room where we read from the Bible and Child's Garden verses, where we listened to the music of, I later learned, Scott Joplin. The kitchen of the house my father had owned, and before him, his father, in 1860-something, a black man, a colored man, a Negro. And I sat in that sweltering back room knowing not to show my face to his customers who wouldn't understand. But I was grateful. I was grateful to my father in his oft-repeated words, get all the education you can. And I knew that as I sat there, my father's words, and yes, the memory of the rumbling of Midnight Mariah had enabled me to get all the education I could. Thank you.
While I think of it, there is a bathroom just through the double doors at the back, to my left, your right. And there is another one back here once the bookshelves are opened. Are we going to give this a try to bring in?
Sure.
We're going to give it a try. Before I do introduce our next storyteller, who hopefully will be sharing a poem with us, I want to give another shout out to our generous sponsors. vocal artists Maria Dawn Puziello, the urban team Olivia Marston and Dee Dee Strode, and the Reinvention Rebels podcast series, also to Linda Ludwig and Catherine Hill. Hopefully, you will find Alicia Reitz as a dynamic, bilingual storyteller of Mexican American heritage who brings her stories and poetry to life using voice, movement, music, and song. Influenced by wildlife adventures on sea and land, Alicia shares a poem today about another adventure seeker, her mother, who told her, quote, "Life is an art. Make yours a masterpiece." Please welcome Alicia, who comes to us today from Forest Knolls, California.
Hello, everyone. Growing up in the Depression, my mom, Alice, Effie, John, flourished into many roles, a wealth in the Legion of Rosie Hunter, an award-winning artist, a master partner, and an honored educator, counselor, and docent for the San Diego schools and museum. She was a vibrational wife in the 40s, mother of 3 children. She was a skilled researcher for many organizations like the the Evolutionary Ecological Expedition to Australia to study the sex life of a nut tree. She loved me, so I did. Around the world, out we go, in train, she will travel. Alice traveled in a muffled forward on planes across the desert. She flew in the first jump jet, then rode a camel in Australia, and camped in Kansas. In the outback, she a researcher counting rains on a nutmeg tree. She paddled a canoe. She flew in a monocle too. She enjoyed Greenlanders. They're mighty diners. At 75, she was overdrive, racing her Nelly bones, laughing, singing in the sweetest tones. Now, they did not she'd buy 10 of the tickets and win 6 of the prizes. Crossword puzzles followed her around. She loved to solve them. A kid loves a good clown. Never want to be idle, and a wizard with a needle. She created award-winning crafts.
Wendy Marins, a fellow native Brit who grew up listening to her father tell stories. We should all have been so lucky. This love of the spoken word probably influenced her decision to become a speech therapist. But more importantly for us, a teller of her own stories. She shares a story today about her Nana Morley. You'll notice in the program a mistake I probably made. It's Manna Morley, as stated erroneously. But while I am prone to error, Wendy's telling is fluent and her language precise. Wendy Marins.
I still shudder when I think about the pickup She smelled like warm lavender, no matter what time of year, daubed onto her monogrammed linen hanky from a small, round, cut glass bottle that looked as if it should have held magic potions. When I leaned in to kiss her cheek, it was white and powdery, like lightly floured dough. I don't remember her voice or conversations we must have had, but she always wore a black hat, a black skirt, a well-tailored cropped jacket, and black leather shoes. I loved her as if she were magic, a little dangerous, about to disappear. And I'm not even sure if that memory of how she looked was really a memory of that or of some sepia-coloured 1920s photograph. Each weekend we'd pick her up for a Sunday run, not some precursor to a marathon for seniors, but a peculiarly British habit of taking a drive in the countryside on the weekend, sometimes with a pub lunch thrown in, hopefully no hiking involved. And she would always hand me a white paper bag. And I know this is going to make me sound shallow, but it was one of the reasons I loved her. It was full of Quality Street chocolates, milk chocolates covered in brightly coloured foil, with fillings I knew by heart. On the weekends when my sister came with us, we would fight viciously over who could have the one royal purple prize. It was filled with liquid toffee and a hazelnut. My mother, quick to seize a moment, would threaten to eat it for us. Those chocolates taught me the art of scrupulous turn-taking and honestly confirmed my thought that only children had a definite advantage in the world. The problem with this idyllic scene was, as I said, the pickup. Nana Morley, my grandmother, lived at the end of a long, sweeping paved driveway with perfectly manicured lawns on either side and massive cedar trees whose branches swept down and kissed the grass. The driveway opened up to an austere, large, red brick Dickensian-looking building. And one of the things I never noticed in any of those visits was that the grounds were surrounded by a high black metal fence, and that in order to get into the driveway, we would actually have to go through a locked gate worthy of Kensington Prison. My father would drive up to the front door, and my mother would say to me, "Go in and get Nana." I never questioned this thing. So I would go up to the front door with a sense of dread. I had not yet heard about horror movies, but I had read Jane Eyre. I pushed the door open, probably not with a creak, and stepped inside to a vast dimly-lit hall, where someone came and asked me who I was there to see. They went off to find Nana and left me waiting, listening to keening wailing noises from upstairs while these waif-like women would waft past me. Some of them would approach hungrily with outstretched arms, stopped by the woman who delivered Nana to my care. She handed me my white paper bag. Hush money, kiss it better chocolates. In the preteen years, when family secrets start to be leaked, I came to learn more about my Nana and about the psychiatric institution that she lived in. This prison-like isolation from the community, which would have made me desperately lonely, didn't seem to bother her, living as she was in her private, intrigue-filled reality. And I also came to understand a little better my mother, who sent me in to get her mother, and then who seemed to disappear when Nana was with us like a vapor. I can't conjure up an image in my mind of where she was in the car Nana filled the space. Nana, it turned out, was convinced that my sister was the result of a liaison with a high-ranking member of the royal family. Maybe Prince Philip, maybe Prince Charles pre-Camilla, only I think that would have made my mother a cradle snatcher. And she wasn't. But it did explain her adoration of all things royal. It didn't quite fit that she had the same stature as the Queen, and they had the exact same, never-changing hairstyle. I was convinced they shared a hairdresser. Nana's obsession with my sister led to scary scenarios I only heard about much later. She tried to steal my sister, locking my frantic mother in the pantry. Maybe this was an attempt to return my sister to Buckingham Palace, where she rightly belonged. She was fearfully protective of her. Royal children need bodyguards, after all. But it included hurling boiling water at my grandfather. Royal children can do no wrong. He had reprimanded her for a minor infraction. Nana was also fearful of and preoccupied with sexually transmitted diseases, not something you talked about in the Royal Empire at that point in time, but she accused multiple members of the family of having them, which in turn explained my mother's neurotic response to all things sexual, which she tried to pass down as family wisdom. No wonder I spent an early part of my life thinking, if I just looked at a boy funny, I'd get pregnant, or worse. But, again, years later, I came to understand that particular delusion as probably being related to the fact that her nephew was a specialist in venereal disease. Who knew? The word struck terror in my heart. So my mother, and as a result her daughters, lived in the shadow of my Nana's mental illness, in a small village where there were no secrets and where the whiff of scandal would start a rumour that spread like wildfire, where mental illness was shrouded in dread and secrecy, the stuff of witches. So my mother described people crossing the road to avoid her as if Nana's behaviours may be contagious. At school, girls that she had considered her friends started a petition to block her from being transferred into their class. And in spite of all that, she managed to escape, at least physically. At 16, she left home to become a nurse. She moved into the nursing home in the county town of Derby, nearby. She met the man she married, my father, and they had children, my sister, Her Majesty, and me. She also had an army of small phobias. These included usually things to do with social or sometimes food. So she would tell people I was a picky eater, so she'd take me around the corner. It would be all right. We could have egg and chips. And that way she didn't have to eat with them at the restaurant. In her fridge, she had the food for eating and the food for cooking, which was confusing and definitely not to be confused. And along those lines, we gave up quality street chocolates and moved on to Cadbury's milk tray. I think my mother must have known that her mother had schizophrenia, but she never mentioned the word. And when I on occasion tried to have a discussion about it, she grew silent and vapour-like, just as she had on those Sunday runs. For me, that is obviously the logical medical explanation. But I like to remember and think of my Nana as a little magical. armed as she was with a small round cut glass bottle and a white paper bag full of milk chocolates.
Thank you so much, Wendy. Our next and final storyteller, Carol Birch. 30 years of experience have earned Carol Birch a respected place in the forefront of the revival of platform storytelling, which has been going on in this country for 50 years. We think the Moth Story Hour has sort of reinvented or invented storytelling, but not so. It's been thriving in this country for many, many years. But to Carol, who is a multiple award winner, including the Circle of Excellence Award from the National Storytelling Network, which is the highest award given by this prestigious organization. Carol has been featured on ABC's Nightline, on CBS This Morning, Channel 5 in Boston, National Public Radio, Glamour Magazine, and the New York Times. Gwendolyn Nolan, Professor Emeritus, Southern Connecticut State University, has said, with a gift for phrasing and subtle characterization, Birch's narration blends her candor with the tenderness of a trustworthy friend. These descriptors will be much in evidence in the heartwarming and poignant story she's sharing with us this afternoon. Carol Birch.
You know what? Why don't I take it off? That would be so much easier. What an afternoon. I mean, what a display of the women we've heard about and these women who have brought them alive for us. Really, I think Denise and Jen need a round of riotous applause. It is so much easier to tell a story than to put on an event. But I'm so glad to see some of you who I know, and it's also so exciting to see people I actually don't know. So we will be new friends. My mother in 1920 was in a factory twisting dough into pretzel shapes in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She was 11 years old, and she almost hadn't survived childhood because when she was 4, she contracted pleurisy, which was a life-threatening illness in those years before penicillin. She always remembered her father. He stood over her and said, "God doesn't want her, and the devil won't take her. So I guess we're stuck with her." Who knows why he said that or how he said it, but his words haunted her. His words and the pinch of poverty throughout her childhood helped solidify my mother's decision to live well. You've heard the phrase, living well is the best revenge. And he used to think it was the word revenge sort of gave it a sense of the tenor of her life. But really, you know what? My mother was fiercely determined to live and to live well. And living well meant you had fun. My mother liked to have a good time, and she taught me that if I wanted to have a good time, I better learn to bring it with me. I saw her get up in the morning and put a devil-may-care look on her face.
I heard her sing as she wrestled sheets, towels, clothes for sometimes up to 8 people into those old wash tubs and then rinse tubs and then through those ringers, which were sometimes called mangles because that's what they would do if your hand got caught. And she would sing as she festooned the cellar with wet sheets and then days later take it all down and iron all of it. She ironed sheets and my dad's boxer shorts, everything in between. And this was before steam irons. Some of you do remember probably soda bottles with little sprinkler caps, and you'd sprinkle the clothes and roll them up so the dampness would sort of seep through it before you attacked it with those old heavy irons. My mother sang as she scrubbed floors inside the house and as she scrubbed the front stoop outside the house, because a good homemaker in those days would go out and sweep the street in front of your row house and then wash down the steps that led up to it. My mother sang from an odd, unfathomable playlist. Hymns were her favorite. What a friend we have in Jesus, all our sins and griefs to bear. Well, that song just might slide into the one we heard at the beginning. Pack up your troubles in an old kit bag and smile, smile, smile. Except my mother would sing crazy words like toss out the glue and then put on the stew and smile. Even as a child, the words were jarring. And as I grew older, with my brother Bob, we would roll our eyes or we would correct her. But my father, who could be quite critical, just beamed when Mother sang, and sometimes he would sing oh so softly, just under her voice. Music was a forge that smoothed out their rough edges. It formed a bond between them, and they both did without in their lives, so that all 4 of us could have music lessons. My mother sang as she worked in the kitchen. She was an accomplished cook, but my mother was an extraordinary baker. Toothsome creations that were so miraculously refreshing that decades later we still moan with pleasure, remembering those hot crawlers. Somebody said, it's not crawlers, Carol, it's crawlers. A harder word to say. But you would take them out of the deep fat where they were frying and sprinkle them with sugar so the sugar melted on it. And then she'd make delicate cream puffs stuffed with vanilla cream and drizzled with the most exquisite chocolate sauce. My mother was an artist in the kitchen, which is what made it so strange how she kept the kitchen cabinets. You could not open a kitchen cabinet without inviting an avalanche. You learned a private metallic braille. You opened the door just a little so you could squeeze your arm in, and then you would feel around for the ridge or the handle or the lid, and you would pull it out as you slammed the door shut. Mother thought if something was a jumble and it was out of sight, that was okay. And she never straightened those things that were out of sight and jumbled on so many levels. My mother lived to serve. She served us in the house, and when she went out of the house, she served. She worked for the church tirelessly. She worked for the United Way, the community chest. She bound books for the blind. 2 days each month. She visited 2 different mental hospitals. And one day, my sister called her. My sister Marion had 4 little boys, and they were just starting to get over being violently ill. And my sister woke up. She was violently ill. She asked Mother for help, and my mother said, "Oh, no, I can't help you today. Today I visit the people at Mayview, and they depend on me." Well, it's the kind of remark that brings a daughter up short. But my mother didn't want to just volunteer. She wanted to work, and it mortified my father. My mother served as if her life depended on it. And I think in her mind it did, because she misquoted the Bible her whole life, my whole life. The Bible says faith without works is dead. The faith is dead without works. Mother said, no, it says faith without works is death. And I think she feared that it would be her death. I don't know whether it's her father saying God didn't want her, but Mother seemed to want to earn her way into the heaven she sought. She wanted to volunteer, yes, but she wanted to work, and this was so hard for my father. But they married June 29th, 1929, before the crash, but just in time for the Great Depression. And it was part of my father's manhood. It was his pride, but it was also an expression of his love to provide for the family. He didn't want somebody saying he was a kept man. And people said things like that back then. Mother worked every chance she got. And she worked on and off for an ice cream company in Pittsburgh. She said, "Oh, honey girl." Mother was honey. I was honey girl. "Oh, honey girl," she'd say. "It's like a live soap opera that I get to enjoy as I pack popsicles." My father would beam at her and say, "No one does more than my Mildred." My mother worked for that company for more than 30 years. To get a benefit, you had to work a year and a day. They never let her work a year and a day. They'd keep her on for 10 months, 11, lay her off for 2 weeks, maybe 3, and call her back. But she left school like so many of these other mothers in the 5th grade, and I don't think she had any confidence that she could fight for her job. She'd just be replaced. Well, Daddy would say sometimes, "Mildred, you work so hard. Come on, sit down. Let's relax." My mother always did this one gesture. One hand over her neck, the other over her stomach, and she would say, "Eddie, I can't sit down. If I sit down, I'll think. If I think, I'll cry." What avalanche of regrets or resentments or yearnings so choked my mother that the only way to push them down was through incessant activity. She knew who she was when she had a task to do, and like so many of us, she liked who she was when she served others. But if she was going to sit still in silence, really, who was she? My father died in 1981. He was 74. He died of cancer. Mother lived decades longer. She didn't die until 2003. She was 93. And Alzheimer's ate up the last 8 years of her life. The year before she died, I paid a quartet to come and sing for Mother on her birthday. And I couldn't believe it. When the aide brought her into the room, she was sound asleep. She was never asleep at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. She was falling out of a wheelchair, her mouth open, the broken teeth, the thinning hair, her swollen legs, her feet stuffed into men's slippers. It was so hard to look for my mother, her stylish self, all strutting, and you couldn't see her in all this, and I thought, her spirit's gone, everything's gone. They brought her over, and I took her hand, and I'm going, Mummy, wake up, which was strange, because I never called my mother Mummy my entire life. But I did that day. She didn't wake up, and the musicians couldn't wait, and so I nodded. They began. I sat there, trying to be a good audience member. And halfway through the first song, my husband, who was sitting on the other side of me, tapped my hand and said, Sweetie, look. And he pointed down at my mother's feet. They were tapping in time to the music of the song the men were singing. I looked at her face. She still looked like she was sound asleep, still falling out of the wheelchair, mouth open. My mother looked like a derelict in a dress. But her feet tapped in time to the music, and when the second song started, she was blinking, and her fingers were snapping, and her feet were tapping. Third song, her arms were in the air, like she was at a frickin' rock concert. Fourth song, she's scrabbling, trying to free herself from the wheelchair she was imprisoned in, and I saw that my mother wasn't gone. Her spirit was still alive. Her face was eager, curious, like I hadn't seen in years. And I looked at her and thought, this woman taught you, pack up your troubles in an old kit bag, and damn it, sometimes you just have to smile. Smile. Oh. Please give a hand to our impressive storytellers. Extraordinary. And our next show, I have to say, is June the 5th. We are juxtaposing the decades. No, it's a secret. And I know the secret. And I really didn't want to walk through Our next show is June the 5th. The decades will be the 50s and the 70s. And here's the thing. It's if the story, the person could have been born in the 50s, or the story could have been shaped by the 50s. It does not matter. If you have a story from that decade, or the 70s, the 50s or the 70s, and you feel that you would like to share that story, come and sign up. But make a note that our next show will be here. We do have a wine and cheese reception, so we will file back and get our cheese and come and chat.
and you can ask the storytellers questions. I thought if we opened the back doors a little bit, we could get some breeze in here so we feel a little more comfortable, because we'll have to take off our masks, of course. Before we go into that, I have a book of my short stories. You'll find Auntie Lily in there, CDs. The money is, the price for my book, for my CDs are there. There's change in the glass jar, so you can just help yourself to a book. They're $20, the CD's $15. Shameless, I know. And before we enjoy this wine and cheese reception together, I want to give a special round of applause for our illustrious sound technicians, Kevin Ewan, Eamon, Fernando, to Eric, my husband, who created the program and flyers and also directed traffic. I hope he didn't yell at me. And finally, to our hosts, Julie Zimmerman and Paul Anastas. And Julie is standing at the back. Yes, bravo. They had the creative foresight that really rescued this 150-year-old library and renovated it into this multimedia, cultural and theatrical space. And if you ask Julie very nicely, she might tell you where she's hidden the beds and where they keep the Batmobile. Yeah. So I'm now going to lower the screen. You're going to sit patiently for the last slides and the music. So we'll need the projector on, and then I will put the screen back up again, and we can party.
Projector takes time to warm up.
Private Quest is a funny little codger with a smile. A funny smile. 5 feet none, he's an awful little dodger with a smile. A funny smile. Plus or broke, he'll have his little show. He can be surprised. All the other fellows have to grin when he gets to this off his jack.
Is it?